today, some drawing, and this will be quite relaxing as well. We're just going to do one drawing. It's going to be of hands, but don't get worried about that because it's going to be really just an exploration of how you go about, trying to adjust and fine tune rather than going, okay, we're going to produce this amazing drawing of hands today. Because you'll never get to the amazing drawing of hands if you haven't had time to really kind of see what works and which of your pencil strokes work the best. Now, I like to do a lot of figurative work on tone paper. I think it's kind of fun because you can get the highlights in. You're not depending completely on just doing a lot of drawing of grays and that sort of thing. But most of all, it gives you a sense of, sort of being able to step away from the idea of, okay, I've got to fill my white paper with all of this stuff and I'm worried about the idea of, these fingers. Instead, you can start to look at shape a little bit more, which I think is really important. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So welcome back to another Summer of Drawing, class number 14. And we're heading into the end of the summer, and I just can't believe it. So this one is going to be pretty simple on the theme of home. I call it Coffee at Home. And it's a drawing that we'll be doing today of someone holding a coffee cup. Now, instantly, all of you people who aren't all that familiar or comfortable with drawing hands are going to be wondering what we do with the sweater and all of that. So we're not going to be approaching this today like we normally do with the no-tan and all of that. We are only going to be working on hands. And in fact, when I gave myself about the same amount of time to do this, not only did I get myself in trouble in one part of the drawing pretty quickly and couldn't get myself all the way out of it, but also I really decided to concentrate on one hand only and kind of a portion of the coffee cup. So you may decide to do the same thing, depending on how large you work. I tried to work a little larger today to give me a bit more room, but that also meant that in the time that we have, it was, that's more landscape to cover. But let's talk for a second about the interpretation of the theme of home. In this particular case, I was thinking of, the idea of cocooning, comfort, and what symbolizes that. Well, for me, it's sort of I come home and I want a, cup of coffee or a cup of tea. If it's cold outside, I might have a more comfortable sweater rather than business clothing or something like that on. And so, of course, there are lots of ways you personally might decide to interpret that. So things that symbolize, comfort and cocooning, fireplace, or, if your home is actually a tent, and it might be a campfire, cooking, maybe the breakfast dishes that were left on the table, because that assumes that you've got a place to eat, that kind of thing. And also, what I liked about the reason I would kind of gravitated towards this image to symbolize home, even though it's just somebody holding a coffee cup, was that this is sort of a non-institutional cup. It's not necessarily a cup that you would get at a restaurant or something like that if you ordered a cup of coffee. So that just sort of very subtly implies home as well. So even though there really are only three things in this image, we still have a way, even with that much simplicity, to kind of work in a little bit of information that a human being would understand, represented, comfort, relaxation. And so for observation, how are we going to interpret this scene? What are we drawing here? Well, there really are only the three things. There's the mug, the sweater, the hands. But I think what we're after is the sense of enclosing, of cradling, warmth. The hands are relaxed. There's no tension. That hand that's sort of even holding the bottom of the cup, it's not a tense hand in any sense. It's very relaxed. And so as we draw, we want to kind of emphasize that. So how are we going to draw? I wanted to show you very quickly some sketches by Raphael and one other artist, just to kind of show you where I'm thinking of going today. And that is to really be concentrating mostly on line, the line work of the hands. How is that hand working? How are those hands working? Then adding a little bit of shading. And we're going to add a little highlight as well, just to sort of, because we're working on the tone paper. But this isn't a day for worrying about a ton of modeling. If you want to blend, you can blend. If you want to hatch, you can hatch using any of the drawing tools that you have available. What we're really after is trying to work out the very complicated relationships between all the parts of the hand, just as a drawing, never mind worrying about anatomy, which we're really not getting into today. So this is another drawing. These are preparatory drawings that Raphael did, for paintings and that kind of thing. But you can see that he did them exactly the way that I'm talking about, where he started with line and added in the shading. Here's some more. Once again, he's messing about with foreshortening. He, had to make a few changes about how he was doing, how the hands might look for the gesture that he wanted. And here's Barocci's sketches as well. He did a series here. You can kind of see how he's trying to figure out how should those fingers go together? What does that look like? And they're really abbreviated. He's not putting any kind of anatomy in. He's trying to figure out sort of where the lost edges are. Where should the back end of the hands be? How should that work? How should the light come through? And they're very stylized. So if you feel like working like that today, not worrying about the detail of the knuckles and all of that sort of thing, that's fine, because we actually won't be able to see a lot of that in the image that we're looking at. So here we are again. So we're looking at this, and the first thing that probably happens is you're seeing all that texture, you're seeing color, the color of the skin in the hands, thinking how you're going to make that into pencil. And then there's the problem of the odd shapes. So let's start off kind of slowly by just looking through a few things. First, I changed this to a grayscale to start off with, just so you could see a little bit more clearly what the definition is. So if we squint to look at the contrast, it removes the color information. That's basically the same as turning it into a grayscale like this. We want to look only at the shapes of light and dark, and that's difficult enough. But today, because we're not just kind of shading in areas of light and dark, we actually want to start with an outline. It's kind of good to sort of, when we do squint, we're looking at, well, where are those edges that we can see? So thinking back to, what Howard Speed said about, why we draw outlines and why we draw edges, what we want to do today, and this is much more difficult rather than just sort of outlining everything, is we're trying to suggest that feeling of form, that sort of convincing form, but using line to start with rather than just using shading. So one of the first things that some artists do is start with this idea, you can see in red on both of the hands, of what's sometimes called an envelope, where you look at the big outside shape of what it is you're trying to draw. Because really, if you haven't got that outside shape just about right, then no matter what goes on inside, it's not going to work. It's not going to have that feeling of convincing form. It's not going to look, just so. Now, I tend to not necessarily always sketch out like that, but sometimes when I'm figure drawing, I do. It can be helpful or not, as you want. If you do that, just do it very lightly to get that kind of the big shapes here. The other things to look for are directional lines that could be helpful as you continue the drawing. In this case, the sweater is full of those directional lines. You can see that by just using like a big chunky pencil or one of the beveled tip pencils, just to indicate a few lines going here and there, as following the form, that does a great job. There's also some really great directional lines on that mug that help you figure out what's going on. And then from a point of view of perspective, you can get into that as it comes to the hands. Obviously, they've got some dimension to them, particularly the one that we see on the right, curves around to the back. And that will cause all kinds of problems, as it did for me when I was sketching. But more importantly, I was looking at that line in the middle, the green line in the middle. That's basically where our eyes are. And the way I can tell that is because the curve of the top of the coffee cup and the curve of the bottom of the coffee cup are pretty much the same. They're kind of mirror images of each other, which means that, the top of the cup is disappearing up out of our view that way, and the bottom is going that way. We're about in the middle. So that's just helpful when you get to the point of actually drawing that curve in, to remember that you're not far above your level of your eye. So the curve is not going to be acute. It's not going to be very round. It's going to be almost flat, a really, really, really flat oval. So when things get complicated, when you're drawing hands or feet or ears or anything else, what I find it's really useful to do is to just sort of go, okay, what is the shape here that I'm trying to draw? Just even part of a shape, is it a triangle? What does it actually look like? And if we compare that to the color image over here, you can really see, particularly of that finger in the hand we see on the right, that's sort of going underneath to, support the bottom of the coffee cup like that. That is a very difficult finger to get that factual information out about, oh, I should be able to see all the knuckles and all of that. It's very easy to draw more in than you actually see in front of you. And so breaking it down to these shapes when you run into trouble is problematic. The other shape I pointed out was under the right hand thumb over there. And I'm just going to refer to it as stage, like stage right, stage left, rather than this person's left and right, which would be the opposite. So stage right, we've got the shape that's underneath the thumb. And that can help as well. If you find yourself lost at various different points in time, you can look at the other shapes of the clothing, of the shadow, of the cup, or whatever, even of the reflections that you see in the cup to help get you back on track. So, the last sort of thing you worry about are these small indicators or roadmaps of where planes change. Going from the top where the highlight hits, rolling around to the side of the finger. If you look at your fingers, straight on, they're not round sausages. They're actually more like rectangles, rounded off rectangles. And so if you think of that, you'll know that you're looking for some rounded edges at some point that fall off somewhere. If I do a painting, for example, I just almost like this stuff in blue here. I just mark out where I see those changes happening because it'll help me remember that I'll need value changes or something like that going on there. But I don't get into that right away. Some of that when I'm drawing starts to develop as I go along. But first of all, I'm interested in those big shapes and trying to get that to work out. So what we're going to do today, and we are going to spend the whole class on this. So you're going to get a good 15 minutes at each of these stages because this is not easy. What we're going to do is we're just going to work on whatever you can manage on this drawing. Whichever hand you want to do, like I said, I got myself started in on the right hand that's on the right hand side, and ran into problems right away and spent my whole time solving them, trying to figure out, how to get from one spot to the next. So while you get started on that, and what I did was because I was working on a mid-color toned paper, I started with an HB pencil. I held it quite a ways back and I tried to get long strokes just to get, as you see on the right hand side, on the left hand side, what I started to get worked out there was just sort of that kind of that envelope feeling. But once I started to add in a little bit more detail, I was going over strokes more than one time in order to be able to, get them a little bit darker. I was doing a bunch of erasing. But I think that when you're dealing with something as complex as this, it does take a little bit of time to start sorting out, what's going on. One of the things you'll want to do continuously is measure your angles. So yeah, I found the coffee cup to be both helpful and problematic in that, you've got this cup. Do you arrange everything about the hands to that shape? Because if that shape isn't quite right, then perhaps your hands aren't going to be quite right, which is exactly what happened to me. I started going off the upper right-hand corner of the coffee cup for my angles, and some of them turned out to be spot on, and some of them didn't. So while you're doing that, I just need to grab a little bit I want to read to you because I want to talk to you about some other ways of approaching drawing the figure and drawing, hands and doing all of this kind of stuff. So 1 second. Okay. So, there are lots of different artists that have taught figurative work over time. And one of them, really well-known fellow, especially to the Art Students League students for many years, was a fellow by the name of George Bridgman. And he wrote a number of different books on anatomy. I think at least one of them is in Clam's figure drawing book, but there are quite a number that he wrote. And I decided not to show him your art, show you his artwork today because his approach was a little bit more of a constructive approach, meaning that you've probably seen people draw a person by saying put the blocks together, and then the larger block for the chest and smaller one for the waist, larger one for the hips, that kind of thing, which is very good to understand when you're trying to figure out the weight of a body and all of that sort of thing. But I tend to approach drawing things like hands not from the idea of like start with this wedge and then add the fingers and that kind of thing. It's a useful bit of information to know about, and I certainly recommend George Bridgman's books, but I like to just start with trying to work out the puzzle of what we're actually seeing and use that other information to inform me. But Bridgman's books, along with oh gosh, a number of others, I'm trying to think uh, of who else, some other names, like Andrew Loomis is another one. Andrew Loomis is an artist who was another illustrator popular in the early 1900s. And once again, had his own stylized way of drawing hands. And all of these different artists are really worth looking at, particularly the illustrators, because they often had to really understand their anatomy, but were able to figure out ways to simplify it as they went, because they had to work on a deadline very quickly, kind of like we do in class. And be able to suggest, hands, figures, cars, whatever it happened to be, in a way that we would interpret it as being realistic, but wasn't getting into, the more fine art way of approaching figure drawing. So there's a lot to be learned by looking at how they simplify. Now, when I was younger and I wanted to get into, sort of comic book art and that sort of thing, especially in high school, there were a few people, in my classes who were very much of that type of artist, and we were all doing a lot of work in pen and ink. And so simplifying and trying to get those lines right, was something we were trying. We were doing it though, really from less of a understanding of how anatomy really worked, and so it was a bit of guesswork. We weren't necessarily looking at pictures and then trying to figure out how to make our lines do what we wanted them to do. Now, later on, as I started working in screen print and doing that kind of thing, I learned to, modulate my lines, make them thick and thin where I wanted them to sort of disappear or help suggest form. So to get back to George Bridgman for a second, he taught anatomy classes for many years, figure drawing classes at the Art Students League, and he worked really quite large. I am going to send around, when I send around the PDF, I'll add in a picture I found just before class started, of course, of the size of his drawings. They were quite large because he would have a class of students, and he'd have these huge, huge pieces of newsprint, and he was drawing, hands and such at a scale of feet, or at least, a foot, rather than small, the way that we are for this kind of class. But he sounded to me as if he was quite an interesting character. So I was trying to find out a little bit of information so that I could read a bit about him to you, and maybe you would be interested in looking up some of his anatomy books as well. So while you're continuing to draw for, I'm about, I guess, about 8 more minutes at this stage, just sort of trying to get those angles right, just keep at it. If you're not quite happy with how things are going, erase a bit, try it again. This is not, hands are not easy. We have to, when it comes to any body part, faces, hands, and feet being the absolute worst, although I think heels are almost worse than toes, we have to really override that factual information, that outline information we have about what we know the shape is. Now, of course, it's useful to understand the shape, because that way, when we can't quite interpret what we're seeing, does that hand just disappear in space? No, of course, it's attached to a wrist. We know that. So there has to be some sort of continuity of direction or feel going on eventually. But we don't want to be trying to cram 5 fingers in if we can't see 5 fingers. So let me just find this right here, because I thought this was quite interesting. After over time, I've started to realize that some of these artists are real characters. And um, I think this fellow kind of took it to the nth degree. Perhaps not quite as bad as Benvenuto Cellini, but okay. So this is an article by Jerry Weiss, he's actually an instructor now at the Art Students League. But he was, I believe, a student, or his father was a student of George Bridgman, and he wrote quite a good article. Actually, I'll send the link in the PDF as well. So here we go. I owe my existence to George Bridgman. It was 1940, and my father, a young cartoonist who decided he needed instruction in figure drawing, enrolled in Bridgman's class at the League. He met my mother, an aspiring fashion illustrator, in the second floor gallery. She was on a scholarship to study with Bridgman, but skipped class because she found his critiques too brusque. By 1940, Bridgman had earned the right to be brusque. He'd taught drawing and anatomy at the Art Students League in New York for 40 years. He was the preeminent instructor of figure drawing in this country and is credited with having taught close to 70,000 students, from illustrators to the avant-garde. George Brant Bridgman, 1864 to 1943, was born in Ontario, Canada, and grew up in Toronto, where he studied at the Ontario School of Art. In 1883, he went to Paris and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts with Jérôme and Boulanger. In 1889, Bridgman made New York City his home, and in 1898, he began teaching at the League. He would continue to instruct there, but for an interruption from 1900 to 1903 until 1943. He married, had a daughter and a granddaughter. That's a terse biographical outline, which I'll attempt to flesh out with anecdotal material and observations about Bridgman's work. Except for the error in nationality, my father's recollections give a sense of Bridgman's class in his later years. The following is excerpted from an interview published in 2004. Bridgman was a short Englishman who had a habit of pulling on his suspenders. He was bald-headed and was a genius. He'd put a piece of chalk at the end of a 3-foot stick and go to work on the charcoal paper with us. He could go from A to Z with the human anatomy. He knew every muscle, every vein in the body, backwards and forwards by name. I never knew anyone who had the amount of knowledge about the human figure that he'd do. He'd look at your drawing, and the first thing he would ask for was your chamois, which was a little cloth. Author's note. In the version my father told me, Bridgman sat in the student's chair and wordlessly raised his open hand for the reception of said cloth. You'd give him your chamois, and he'd wipe out your drawing. In half a minute, he'd redraw your work and show you how it should be done. He drew that quickly. Once in a while, he'd tell you a joke. He was all business, but he had a sense of humor. He was a very congenial man. There was nothing mean about him. He was a little on the cocky side. He wasn't a tough critic of his students. When your work was really good, he'd just touch it up a little bit here and there and compliment you. Once a week, he'd put his initials on someone's drawing, which meant that that student's drawing would go into a special showcase for the best drawings of the week. My father welcomed the professional criticism. The experience confirmed his belief in the importance of figure drawing study. This idea had an incalculable influence on my training and direction as an artist. Right, just a few more minutes on this stage before we move on to the next bit. During my first year of study at the League, my father and I paid a visit to Edmund F. Ward at his home in White Plains. Mr. Ward, once a prolific illustrator, was then well into his 80s and worked on a very large canvas for his own pleasure. He had studied with Bridgman around 1911 and recalled that each week a numerical was awarded to the best drawings. Ward said that he was hard-pressed to finish better than second place because the artist with whom he shared a studio always received top honors from Bridgman. We'll return to that momentarily. Mr. Ward's drawing belonged to the academic conventions of the era, a highly naturalistic study with a fully resolved value range. That's more than a generation between this drawing and that of my father's, the later work showing the influence of Bridgman's increasingly formulaic approach. Alongside Ward's figure is a simple demonstration of the foreshortened lower arm, lightly drawn and almost Cézanne-like in its abstract cylindrical conception. It's a more subtle expression than what we're familiar with from Bridgman's books, and evidences a stylistic evolution. Whether his evolution as a draftsman was a product of or influenced by broader academic trends is a matter of further study. All right, just a little bit more here. The friend with whom Edward Ward shared a studio was Norman Rockwell. In his autobiography, Rockwell remembered Bridgman teaching in a rumpled three-piece suit, and whose degree of inebriation could be gauged by the condition of his necktie. He kept a skeleton in his locker, which would be produced to make an enthusiastic point. See that, he'd say, folding the wrist back towards the forearm. This structure here does it, and he'd go on to explain how the bones and muscles of the wrist worked. It's a damned wonderful thing, he'd say. All right, I'm going to continue that in a minute, but I want to forward on to the next stage for you. So what I want to do today that's a little bit different than the way we tend to approach toned drawing. Normally, I would say, okay, let's go ahead and start massing in the darks and do some shading and this, that, and the other. But for the hand, I think it's really useful, or for any kind of figurative drawing, is pretty early on to throw a little bit of white in there. Throw those highlights in, because what it'll help you do is see where your problems are. And the minute I put some white charcoal down, I saw that the thumb I had over on the right was not quite there. That something was going on, and I wasn't quite sure what it was, but it helped me figure out the direction. I said, okay, my other fingers are sort of doing what they're supposed to. I'm leaving them alone. I know where my problem is going to be. I threw a little bit into the cup, and I even on the other side, even though I wasn't going to finish that out, I wanted to show you that even if you have gone no further than that quote unquote envelope stage, and you just sort of add the highlights in on toned paper, you start to get a feeling of solidity already just by observing where the highlights fall. So when we draw hands, and certainly this morning, you're going to find that you've got a lot of graphite going down, that this is not a delicate drawing, that you're searching around for where your lines go. You've got some stuff erased, you're adding more hatching in, you're doing all of these other things. When you go to draw hands the next time, and you'll have some idea of how you like to approach this and what problems you ran into today, you'll be able to go, okay, once I start with that general shape and start to add in my lines, I don't need to do so many. And I can throw a little highlight in, and maybe then just only a few more lines would be needed to indicate what that hand on the right looks like, rather than all the work that, is being done on the hand on the left. So, this is the kind of thing that we've been doing quite a lot of this summer, where, sometimes we'll have a concept and we want to audition the concept. Sometimes we'll have, an idea that, hey, I'd like to use directional line. I'm not quite exactly sure how. Let me just do a quick sketch that uses directional line and see, what my next step is supposed to be from that. So this idea of, going through all of these stages or these studies, Raphael, those pictures that we looked at earlier, he would do many, many drawings before he started a painting. The other artist whose work I showed you just before we jumped into this, that particular painting he was working on, there was something like 50 drawings that he did, just going over and over, like how did he want to deal with particular areas? Now, how did that hand work? How did the head work? How did the feet work? That kind of thing. And this is how it's done, is just by actually doing it, by actually trying. I think what happens with subjects that are difficult like this, like hands and feet, that we go, yeah, I ought to study anatomy some more. And then you don't. And then you come up with a subject matter where you really do want to add those hands in, and it's a struggle, and you're not quite sure why. So when you have an opportunity, and particularly on toned paper, taking a little time like this just to go, all right, maybe I do one hand or even only part of one hand, or whatever it happens to be, something like this, something this simple, will help you start to figure out, where are you going to run into trouble. So I'm going to let you keep drawing on this, and I'm going to continue with this particular article. So contrary to Edmund Ward's recollection, Rockwell did sometimes finish second, and Bridgman consoled him that a first-place drawing merely indicated proficiency in copying the lessons. As class monitor, Rockwell was present when, class having ended, a janitor would bring Bridgman a beer, and the instructor sat and told stories about his heroes, the illustrators Howard Pyle and Edwin Austin Abbey. When word came of Pyle's death in 1911, Bridgman arrived at the League, tearful and drunk. A Time magazine profile written in 1942, the year before Bridgman's death, acknowledged his influence but framed his commitment as eccentricity. He was known for carrying around a batch of wrist and finger bones in his pocket and earnestly examining them at odd moments on subways and in restaurants. At home, he kept a hand pickled in glycerin and carbolic acid and studied it for weeks until putrefaction forced him to bury it in the garden, to the horror of his Negro gardener. Once a taxi driver, aware of his interest in cadavers, appeared on his doorstep with a dismembered human leg that an unidentified medical student had left in his taxi. Even without the racism buried in its account, Time's prose is patronizing. To anyone who spent time in an art school with serious anatomists, these are reasonably standard stories. Well, maybe not so much the severed leg. While teaching a basic drawing class, one of my teachers, a retired doctor, gifted me with a skeletal hand and pelvis. Such are the occupational benefits. More problematic was his teaching style. Rockwell remembered that Bridgman would extract a piece of red chalk from his pocket, walk to the model stand, and draw the muscles on the stomach and the line of the rib cage right on the model with his chalk. The models disliked this. They say it gave them a queasy, squirmy sort of feeling to have their muscles marked on their skin in soft red chalk. And then there was no place at the League where they could wash properly, and they'd have to go home with their muscles outlined in red. I thought that was amazing. My mother wasn't alone in being put off by Bridgman's penchant for wiping down a student's hard-fought chalk to rapidly replace it with a correction. To be fair, Kenyon Cox, whose depiction of a female draftsman has long served as the League's logo, also obliterated his students' drawing prior to correcting them. Just a note from me, aren't you glad I don't do that? I can't get to your drawings. Anyway, back to this. Somewhere along the line, I picked up a story that Bridgman once sat before a student's drawing and embellished the paper with a dollop of tobacco squirted from his mouth. Lloyd Goodrich, later an art historian and director of the Whitney Museum, studied with Bridgman before the First World War. His recollection from an interview transcript in the Smithsonian Archives: I remember the first criticism I got from Bridgman. Of course, he turned out students by the tens of thousands, I guess. Nobody ever had as many students as George Bridgman did, teaching anatomy, drawing from a cast, and so on. A very skillful academic draftsman. He took my drawing and just rubbed it all out with his chamois cloth and began to draw it himself all over again. I said, well, Mr. Bridgman, I don't see it that way. And he said, consult an oculist. Goodrich continued, Bridgman had a formula. He couldn't have taught if he didn't have a formula. Teaching as he did, I suppose, several hundred pupils a week, he had to teach them a certain kind of drawing. Tricky but knowledgeable. He was a great old boy and people loved him up there. I had a few of Bridgman's books when I was a kid, and I didn't much connect with their formulations. In large part, this owed to the distance between the drawings and direct observation. The stylized emphasis on serpentine movement, hinges and wedges, block and cylindrical shapes overwhelmed individual characterization. My first figure drawing drawing teacher cautioned that Bridgman's work was too mechanical. Fine with me, I was happy with to find a less systematic aesthetic. For the next 25 years, there was no reason for me to reconsider the matter. Dean Keller prompted my reassessment of Bridgman. Like Bridgman, Dean taught life drawing and anatomy at the League. His stint was brief, owing to ill health, but he'd previously instructed and lectured for many years at the Lime Academy of Fine Arts, where we were colleagues. Dean's father, a longtime instructor of art at Yale and one of the famous monument men of World War II, had studied with Bridgman. Dean lionized Bridgman. Not long before his death in 2005, he came upon a collection of Bridgman's figure drawings done in charcoal on sheets of paper that were each roughly 5 by 9 feet. One evening, I joined Dean, students, and colleagues as they unrolled the pages to be photographed. These were demonstrations for Bridgman's anatomy classes, and the scale and power was unlike anything I'd seen. His books are a testament to the efficacy of his instruction, but they lack the substantive thrill of the actual drawings, and one surmises the in-person lectures. The energy Bridgman brought to an ostensibly clinical subject must have been something to behold. The drawings are absolute in the confident expression of the anatomist's knowledge. The manner of his successor, Robert Beverly Hale, was poetic and cultivated by comparison. It is no wonder that Bridgman's stylizations are instantly recognizable in his students' drawing. The purpose of Bridgman's drawing was pedagogical. His lessons were meant to be seen from across a crowded classroom. Instructor demos are the most ephemeral of artworks, and all the more so when drawn on enormous sheets of cheap paper. My hope is that more will come to light and that students and artists can get a better sense of what Bridgman brought to the League and by extension to American art. So I hope that'll pique your interest a little bit to look up George Bridgman and see what he was up to. I think that understanding looking at his drawings in light of the fact that what's reproduced often in the books are some of these large-scale drawings that he was doing in the moment as part of a demonstration, and trying to show, how the body works, how it moves, how it hinges, how the I guess the rhythm, the dynamic rhythm of the form works. So, as I said, when I was younger, I had books by Bridgman, and they were really helpful to me to start to understand how a hand looked, because I really didn't have the photographic resources, the internet and everything that we do now, just to look up pictures and then try to copy them, that sort of thing. So apart from my own hands, or just sort of what I knew a hand to look like, and then a whole lot of guesswork, it was really difficult to get started on a drawing like that, particularly for the kind of things I want to do. Comic book illustration involves a lot of hands coming out towards you, a lot of foreshortened stuff, things that we don't actually do, gripping, punching, that kind of thing, that we have a concept of, but we haven't necessarily seen actually in action, or a freeze frame so we can understand what's going on. And there was another artist, and now I remember his name, Bern Hogarth, who also did a lot of books that I really love. They're part of my collection now because they've luckily, just like the Bridgman books, have been reprinted. And Bern Hogarth, drew, when you look at his work, for example, and it's Byrne Hogarth, you can see you can see where every comic book and concept artist to date, where the sort of the evolution of all of this artwork came from. The very dynamic, people sort of flying through the air, punching things, all of that, leaping down, pushing up, jumping from a deep knee bend, that kind of thing. But that sort of dynamism has been really helpful to me, actually, when it comes to doing portraiture. And now you might think that's really odd because, in portraiture, people are sort of sitting still. But if you can imbue a painting, even of someone standing or sitting, with a little action and with a little dynamism, that kind of information about how the body moves is really helpful. All of it feeds into your understanding of what is going on. What is going on with the body? How does it move? Your hand can hinge back and forth the way we think of to wave. It can do what this hand is, curve under. The wrist can curve under and support something. That's a really, really complex set of maneuvers. And seeing how different artists, and particularly different illustrators, broke that all down, I think is extremely useful, because they in their head learned anatomy to the point where they could simplify, and each one sort of did it in a different direction, with a different kind of emphasis. Okay, just a few more minutes at this stage, and then we'll get on to what is basically the last step, which is just sort of refining. Now, I hope during the course of all of this, you've probably run into quite a few problems already and managed to work your way out of them. And I think this is the really valuable part about, doing drawing, whether it's taking drawing classes or just drawing for yourself, is to continually reassess. Now, these guys were going on about how, having critiques from Bridgman and all that were very good. And I can understand that, although I'm not really sure how I feel about someone erasing completely my work and putting theirs there. But I do think that at some point you're away from the classroom, you're away from your instructor, no matter how good the instructor was, no matter how many things they pointed out. If you yourself can't see what's going on, oops, sorry, we've got some lawnmowers going by, so if there's a bit of noise in the background, sorry about that. They drive right down the street to the neighbor. So once again, you're going to spend the rest of your life basically not with the instructor. And to be able to work your way out of problems is really important. When it comes to hands and things of this nature, when you do get yourself into the situation where things are going, they're getting difficult and you're not quite sure if you managed it or not. What I normally do, and definitely would if I were going to, either continue with the drawing that I was working on, is I would walk away, go do something else, get a cup of coffee, that kind of thing, and then come back again, look at my artwork compared to whatever it was I was trying to draw. Almost instantly, the glaring problems, will come to the surface. Almost instantly, you'll be able to see where you went wrong. All right, let me move on to the next stage. In this last step, all I want you to do is to continue to explore and refine. So what I managed to do, and I didn't get any further than this, because I gave myself exactly the same amount of time as you, and it takes a lot longer, I think, than most people realize to really kind of get all of the little angles of a close-up of a hand, just right. So at this point, all I want you to do is just for about the next, only about the next 5 minutes or so, because I have some things to update you about at the end. So for about the next 5 minutes or so, just go ahead and do a little bit of refining. I ended up erasing the thumb, repositioning one side of the mug, trying to figure out if I were going to continue with the large, thicker lines on the sweater. How would I go about doing that? So what I would like you to do, if you have the time during the course of this week, next week we're going to get back into drawing a full composition and no-tan and all the rest of that. But if you take a little time to either, whichever hand that you drew, you can either redraw that one or you can work on the other. But just go through this process again of just sort of trying to get your, if you want to, if you really feel dedicated, do sketches, 2 or 3 times and see if you can improve a little bit, each time you go through it. And I hope over the course of the winter, for example, that you can look at how other artists have approached, things like drawing hands and how very different everyone's style is, and their approach and how much detail they put in or don't put in. I think though, just sort of, fighting your way through a project like this is extremely helpful, and it'll get you much more familiar with how hands and things work. All right, just 2 more minutes to wrap this up. I think we have 1 more class where we work with tone paper, but we'll be back to white paper next week, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But my hope for you is that you end up with, over time with lots of either little scraps of paper if you're working from large pieces, or notebooks, full of little things like this, where where you get to a certain point and you're like, okay, I got how that worked. I'm going to maybe start that again on some other day or draw something else in this style, and get to the point where you're so familiar with working with tone paper and what it can do for you that any subject matter seems like a good subject matter to do on tone paper. I just think it's so much fun. Okay, let's wrap this up and move on to the end. Okay, so when it comes to concepts in general, we've been working on the idea of home through the whole summer. And, sometimes it's not a place or an object, but it's an idea, a feeling that you'd like to convey, whether it's, comfort, warmth, solidity, safety, objects and activities that may indirectly transmit that idea are a really great way to approach any subject. So when we think of, for example, peace, one of the first images that will come to many of our minds, just because this is a symbol that has been used for peace so long, is a white dove, with a little olive branch in its beak. This is that kind of very first reaction that we have, is to symbology that is already present in our culture. Certain ideas. Just like when we think of the word home, almost no one can stop that basic idea of a drawing of a house with a window and a door and a little chimney from popping into their heads at some point when we think a drawing of home. So it does take, some real thought to start pulling yourself away from that, even if what you end up with is quite simple. So things that we're looking for, to indirectly transmit those ideas are a few steps removed away from that first idea. And so whether it is things, we were talking before about, the pile of shoes by the door, in this case, a non-food service mug, a comfy sweater, relaxed hands, convey that the person is in a home-like setting or has that feeling of relaxation that could be associated with home. It's interesting that when you decide you want to work to a particular concept or theme, and often, competitions or shows do have themes to them, it can take a little noodling, a couple of walks outside or something like that, to really start moving away and thinking of other symbols that we use rather than the ones that, you might see as icons. So hands themselves can create a sense of relaxation or tension. You're drawing for a human audience, and we understand very subtle nuances and messages that are telegraphed by muscle movements and actions. So think of like fists or hands drooping, finger pointing, upheld palms, face forward. All of those have an instant meaning to us. You can use all of that information to help exaggerate and emphasize what you're doing. So, for example, when you're redrawing those hands, what you don't want is to show, for example, all the tendons and striations on the back of a hand in the way it would look very tense. You want to keep that soft and light, because soft and light hands mean relaxed, mean comfortable, not on guard, safe, all of those kinds of things. So that's just something to keep in mind. Feet, not quite so much, but again, you can show tension. Feet tend to be more used in terms of how the musculature is shown, or the tension, as weight bearing. Where is the weight? Is it on the front foot, the back foot, that kind of thing? Hands have a lot more to do with how we communicate. We communicate visually. And technique, of course, tone paper, which I love for everything, is perfect for figurative approaches. It gets you away from overdoing the skin. Now, when you're doing these initial exploring, you'll put down way more graphite than you need, both white and dark. It's going to happen. And don't try to stop it. Just let it happen. That's what I did today. I was like, oh, I should be drawing perfect hands for my class. And I'm like, no, let's just do this the way you would if you were first exploring what this looked like. And, whatever happens is going to be very like what happens to everybody who's actually in the class here. And I've said before, it's so important for you to see that is what all artists go through, is some sort of path to get to the end result. Let the textures of the scene suggest which tools you use. If you decide to add more sweater in, one of those nice thick beveled pencil ends, a few strokes to represent the darks, as you go across, following the line of the sweater to indicate the body underneath. Perfect way to do that. Likewise, getting some of those reflections, using lines across that mug like that. Perfect. The texture itself, and then all of this bevy of drawing material you've now accumulated, you can use together. And then think about what you're drawing while you're drawing it. In this case, relaxing and comfort. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing screen because I've got a few little things to announce. So let's see. Okay. The one thing I hate about Zoom is looking at myself in the picture, because I tend not to do that until I get actually in the class. And today it's relatively humid and I've been outside with the chickens again, as is reflected in the hairstyle. Anyway, okay. So the first thing I want to do is to mention that I am going to be wrapping up at the end of the 19th class. This is really going to be it for our drawing classes. I really feel at this point that you guys are going to be ready to go. That you can always rewatch any of these classes to sort of remember some of the information that we were talking about. But it's so important for you to be drawing by yourself. And one of the reasons I say that is because I myself spent many, many years drawing by myself. I had one drawing class at some point along the line. And the rest of it just sort of came from, from books, looking at other artists and drawing, just drawing, drawing, drawing. And this is what I want for you guys. I know it's helpful to have a class every week, and it certainly is for me. It's kept me drawing. But it is also really important for you just to get out there and do your stuff. The other thing is I'm going to be spending my time sort of concentrating on a couple of new bodies of painting work that I really want to kind of put blinders on and go for. But it doesn't mean I'm never going to be teaching again. And one of the things that I will be working towards either for next year or next winter, perhaps, is an art appreciation course, because I love to find interesting examples of art from thousands of years ago that look so modern and compare them to where we are now. And just talk about art history and all of that kind of stuff from an artist's point of view, which I think is a little bit different. So that'll be fun, and I'll be doing it with the Vineyard Haven Public Library, I hope. The Martha's Vineyard Drawing Prize is wrapping up in a few weeks' time, about 3 weeks' time, on the 12th of September. And you can go to the mvdrawingprize.com website to have a look at that information if you'd like to enter something. Don't feel pressured. The theme is home. And so what I'm more interested in is that the weekend after that, the 17th, we'll be announcing the winners and the finalists. And you'll probably want to check out how, what their interpretations were. There's some really amazing artwork coming in. So that'll be a lot of fun. I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for being here today and for working through hands. Next week, we'll be back to white paper, and we're going to be working on a subject matter that's, relatively simple, deals with a bunch of angles. So we'll be doing a lot of practice of that. But what it does mostly is we'll be dealing with lots of texture. So have your whole bevy of pencils on hand, including charcoal, blending stumps, the whole bit. It's a small subject matter, but we'll have a chance to use a little bit of everything as we move through. And we'll try to get a whole drawing done this time, in the time frame, rather than today when we were just sort of, sketching and checking things out. All right, everybody, I look forward to seeing you next week.